The final phase of the medieval is the Gothic period, and I often refer to this as the rise of the monarchy. Before this, the feudal system was very much in effect in Europe, and now you see more so that the king and the queen, right, of the country, might we say, are the leaders, right, that people are leaning more towards looking to. We don't see the feudal system holding as much sway, and there's a couple reasons why this happens. Um, the feudal lords, right, the manor lords, had gotten kind of greedy, right, and a little bit complacent and lazy. And they had actually started to sell off what we call charters to the serfs who could raise enough funds, right, over time, right, to create their own town. So what you had to do was buy a charter, and then you could found an independent town, essentially. Originally, feudal lords were not really into doing this because, again, that meant they were losing some power and control over the people. But we see as the medieval went on that they became a little greedy. They wanted a little more money, right? So they'd say, okay, fine, you can start this town. And because of that, again, they started to lose a bit of power over the serfs, and eventually the feudal system starts to crumble a bit more. But you still have the kings and the queens, right, who are in charge of these areas, like the Kingdom of France, of course, and the Holy Roman Empire. We're going to be focusing on our Gothic discussion mainly on France. Before this, we were talking a lot more about the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne, right, Otto's, etc. But now we're really going to be looking at France, and the Gothic is really considered a French style that then travels out to the surrounding regions. So you'll see the Gothic in Britain, you'll see the Gothic in the Holy Roman Empire or Germany, you'll see it in Italy, but it really starts in France and then gets mutated right into those other regions. I am not going to show you any of those types of Gothic, right? So if you want to see, Italian Gothic, right, German Gothic, again, go out and Google it. You'll find it easily. But for our purposes, I'm really just sticking with France for our discussion. So that's why you notice the Kingdom of France really stressed. And we're moving into the time period of about 1200 to about 1400 AD. Again, this is right before the Renaissance, right? So we're moving towards the end of the medieval period. Another interesting thing that happens is the invention of the modern university. And why I bring this up? Because we see more learning coming back into the mix, more critical thought, right? Logic, reason, objective fact, and we don't see as much reliance on mysticism, right, or faith in the way that the medieval world would have for about 1,000 years. This does not mean that these people become less Christian. What I see is I see a merging of their Christianity with this desire to be more learned in a more objective manner. And so I'm showing you this image here of God as the architect of the world, where you still have this idea of God as a planner, a designer, a creator, but it's now been merged with scientific ideals, right? You'll notice he has this sort of like protractor like, type of tool, right? Something that we'd see used in mapping, and he's kind of mapping this protoplasmic mass. It's almost like this idea of God as designer of the universe. And a lot of cultures believe this. If you look at like Islamic art, for instance, they believe that God and science are the same thing. You can't have them be separated. So you can't complain about something found by science because God created it. That they're not exclusive. They're very mutually connected. And so what I think the Gothic people were trying to do is say, yes, we're still Christians, we're still faithful people, we still believe in the church, but we're looking more to this idea of objective education. During the medieval, most education was done through the monasteries. And what we see happen in the Gothic is the foundation of universities like Oxford and Cambridge, which some of the oldest universities out there. And this means that there was now a mix of religious schooling, because you'd still see religious figures teaching at these institutions, but also a more objective attitude towards education. One other thing I want to mention with this image is if you think about what it's showing you about the skill level of the artist. First off, look at the figure. You'll notice that there's a little bit more modeling or shaping, a little bit more sense of reality of the form. That cloak kind of wrapping around the form doesn't look sort of 2D, and now sort of it looks like 3D. It looks like it's actually wrapping around a body. And I love the foot stepping out of the frame. this sense that the artist is skilled enough to know how to break the fourth wall, as we call it, how to break the frame and give you this little illusionistic treat, right? Of this idea of where does the art begin and where does the reality start, right? Where does our world start? Where does art end? So again, we see artists are getting better in this period as we move towards the Renaissance. Now, why is it called the Gothic? It's called the Gothic because it was named by the art historian and critic and painter Giorgio Vasari. Giorgio Vasari lived in the Renaissance period. So he was not living in the Gothic, right? He was living in the Renaissance time period, which is the next period that comes in art history. If you take art history too, right, we start in the Renaissance. And Giorgio Vasari was a painter, but he's probably more well known for his take on art historical method and his founding of the discipline. So people like me, art historians, when we go off to grad school, right? One of the first things that happens is you're usually introduced to Vasari and you're given a copy of the Lives of the Artists, which is his famous text. There's a Lives of the Artists, Volume 1 and Volume 2, and it's required reading if you're an art historian. What Vasari did is he wrote about what it sounds like, the lives of the artists. He used what we call the biographical method. It was the earliest, what we call, method of art history because art history uses different methods. I'm actually a Marxist. This means I look at the social. So if you've noticed in all my lectures, I tell you about the people, the time period, what's going on in the time period. Because to me, art is a function of the social, it's directly tied to it. So I'm a Marxist art historian. Doesn't mean I'm a communist. It means I'm a Marxist art historian, right? It's not about the politics related to Marxism. It's about the idea of the social. You might also meet people who are formalists, right? They'll talk to you about the construction of something, semioticians, right? There's all kinds of different methods that you can use within art history. Vasari created the first method, the biographical method. So he told the lives of these artists. And there's a good reason why biographical method was first used because there was no pictures, there's no photography. It was really hard to show a representation of an artwork in mass, you know? So they basically didn't really have a way to actually talk about the art. You had to describe the art, so they told about the lives of the artists, right? So it's biographical method. So Vasari, he wrote a lot about art history. He also, of course, wrote about the art history that came before his time, which, of course, was the Gothic period. And he was the one who named the Gothic. He actually said it's Gothic because it looks like a bunch of Goths made it. Now, if you go back and look at those different barbaric tribes I talked about, the Goths are one of them. And so he said this art was so bad, it looks like the Goths made it. And Gothic stuck as the title that we call this last period of the medieval based on Vasari's commentary. But you have to really think about this. Vasari is speaking from his time period, looking back. He's criticizing something because it's not like, the revival of the Renaissance that he's seeing. So sometimes it's hard to deal with history, let's say, because you're dealing with it by trying to look back at it and trying to explain it. This is why I'm a contemporary art historian because I like talking about things that are happening right now in the mix while it's going on. I think that's a much more informed viewpoint. Um, but again, why is it called Gothic? You can blame Giorgio Vasari, right, for that. And what makes it Gothic? I would say there's a couple things you can kind of look for, some markers you can find when you're looking at it, and some items that seem to be very particular to the Gothic. The first is the use of different vaulting systems. When we looked at Romanesque, I had pointed out the barrel vault, and I'd said that the barrel vault, was a more simplistic vaulting system, and later you'd see a more complex system, which is the groin vault. So I'll show you a diagram of the groin vault later when we're talking about construction. It sort of takes two barrel vaults and intersects them, right? This leads to more complex architecture. So again, when you're looking at a Romanesque church, you tend to think of it as being a little bit more simple, and then the Gothic is a little bit more elaborate. They're trying to deal with verticality in these structures, so they're going to use flying buttresses. Again, I'll show you a diagram of these and show you how they work. But flying buttresses allow for more verticality or more height to a building. And then finally, you have stained glass. I had mentioned this in the Romanesque lecture as well. I'd said if you think about um, the use of light in a Romanesque structure, there's not a lot of it. It's more heavy cut stone architecture. And then in the Gothic, with the use of buttressing and different things, the space can open up more. And then they used tons of stained glass, which allowed the light to come in. Of course, they put stories in the stained glass as well. So we'll talk about the type of imagery that you'd see in stained glass. So it's practical and also artistic at the same time.